What if support doesn't require hierarchy? Now, somewhere over the years of my journeying through this life, being part of the coaching world, going through my divorce, my own personal evolution, the illusion of brokenness that I carried for years, followed by the endless healing grind, I realized something simple but truly profound. And that is that I don't want to be anyone's guru. Now, I've watched this online landscape shift over the years towards more rage bait, more big money promises, more buy this and your whole life changes. And I realized that my work was never meant to compete with that because I don't want to be put on a pedestal. I don't want to position myself as anyone's savior or their only solution. And I sure as hell don't want to manipulate people's pain to create urgency. What I want to give is something different. Connection, presence, real, honest, meaningful conversation, and awareness. A mentorship that honors people's timing and truth, like their timing and truth without the pressure. Support that feels like walking beside someone, not dragging them. Support that truly respects their wholeness and their sovereignty, that trusts their pace, their knowing, and their unfolding. It's transformation, yes, but in your way, not mine. And this really matters because when it comes to relationships, most of the harm that I witness in the world doesn't actually start with lies. It starts with partial truths placed inside of hierarchy. And that is what we're going to be unpacking today. Welcome to Create Your Happy. I'm Christy Holt, your one and only happiness hussy. And this season, I'm going there. These relationship rants are for the woman ready to stop abandoning herself and start choosing truth. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive in and let's start here. Because what I've noticed is that so much of the relationship advice online isn't actually coming from people who have healthy, secure, loving, emotionally mature relationships. It's coming from entertainers and content creators and influencers, performers, gender war podcasters, and in general, a lot of people who profit from outrage rather than connection. And this is why I think that so many of these so-called relationship experts are getting it wrong, because they speak with confidence and we assume that we're speaking with wisdom. But confidence isn't embodiment. And having a lot of followers and all of this does not mean that you have real clarity. Followers aren't proof of your relationship health, and neither is longevity. Yet these voices are shaping how so many people approach dating, love, and intimacy, and it's quietly distorting everything. Now, there's a massive difference between knowing how a good relationship should look in theory and actually living those healthy relationship dynamics. I mean, you can read every relationship book, every book on attachment, every book on healthy communication. You can learn about polarity. But the thing is, until you've lived the repair process, until you've built something secure, until you've confronted your own patterns and not just read about them, until your nervous system actually feels and knows the connection, it's just theory. It's just information. It's just empty knowledge. Embodied wisdom is earned. I mean, anyone can talk about love, right? But not everyone can hold it. And this is where I think a lot of things quietly go sideways. Sometimes it's not what they're teaching, but when someone claims authority over your inner world, and I'll just sidebar here because I've been watching a few documentaries lately. I watched the one about Jodie Hildebrand on Netflix, but also as I was watching this, the Twin Flames Universe one came to mind and the Apple Cider Vinegar Girl came to mind. And what I was noticing is that these are different worlds, different types of coaches, but they all had the same structure. And what I noticed is they all start with something true enough, right? that accountability matters, that self-awareness matters, that patterns matter, that personal responsibility matters, and, building on the commonly known truths, so-called truths, right? Those things that have worked for a lot of people. And, when I was listening to or watching the Twin Flames documentary, at first I was thinking like, yeah, they're right. These foundational pieces, I was like, I don't know where they're going to go wrong. And then I realized it wasn't their teaching so much initially that was the issue. And now there's a little bit of truth to that. The thing, though, behind this wasn't so much that all of their teachings were dead wrong. That wasn't the issue. The issue was hierarchy. The issue is when one person decides that they know your truth better than you do. And when that guidance turns into governance, then we start to have a problem. When your dissent as maybe the mentee or the coachee or the student gets labeled as resistance because you don't necessarily see things the same way. When you start asking questions, when that gets labeled as resistance, when staying inside of these coaching or mentorship or whatnot, containers, or even following people sort of becomes virtue, and leaving becomes failure, and you're shamed or blocked or removed or all of these things for choosing to take a different path. That's not true mentorship. That's actually just control pretending to be leadership. And the internet loves extremes, right? On one side, we have the red pill creators teaching men that women are just manipulative, emotional, gold-digging liabilities. On the flip side, we have the man-hating feminist accounts, talking about how men are emotionally stunted, useless, or dangerous disappointments, toxic masculinity, and so forth. And the reality is neither of these narratives create connection, but both self-fear, both reinforce division, and both teach people to distrust the gender, most often that they actually deeply crave intimacy with. Now, online, you may have noticed, as I have, that outrage pays. Like, if people are outraged, they comment, right? They argue, they share it. They have so much emotion that they have to express it. And the thing is that often nuance doesn't go viral, right? It sits softly. It doesn't activate the same things that those outrage, clickbaity, rage baity type posts do. But the thing is that real relationships are built on nuance, and they require safety, right? That sitting in our nervous system, not being completely activated at all times, not being outraged, not trying to argue our way through, but finding familiarity with a regulated nervous system. And so this is, I think, where a lot of people can get stuck, because gurus teach tactics and lines. And a lot of times they do not teach humility, presence, or emotional attunement, right? They often will teach online, you'll see 10 ways how to get someone, right? Like, we all want to be God, right? They teach how to control the dynamic so that you feel like you're in control of the situation and you can create the outcomes that you want. They teach you how to win, right? But underneath that, the piece that's missing is that they're not teaching connection. And this is probably largely because of the hierarchy built into that guru mentality in the first place, right? You can memorize perfect lines. You can memorize exactly what to say that creates, these sort of outcomes on the surface, and still be emotionally unavailable. This makes me think back to the first episode of this season. I think it was the first one, about the guy creating his texts using ChatGPT, right? We can say all the perfect things and still under the surface not be mature or emotionally available. And when it comes down to it, real connection requires us to be present and available. And of course, you can, master polarity language and you can still avoid actual intimacy. It can get distorted as well, right? I think about the whole energy of the submission vibe. And of course, there's so much nuance behind that. But oftentimes that's not spoken about. And people really have their own interpretations of what that might mean and look like. And this, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of nuance around that because that's a whole other topic. But the point is that there is this divisive language that speaks to the emotional side of us, that activates us. And that is what tends to go viral online. So, there are all kinds of like red pill rules and man-hating playbooks, as I kind of mentioned earlier. And you could be following all of these rules. You can be following all of the what to do and what not to do and still feel deeply alone. Because, guided scripts and those perfect things to say don't create closeness. They don't create intimacy. Skills do, and embodiment does, right? And hierarchy makes this worse. And again, this does touch on the submission piece because that is very woven into that whole concept of submission, because hierarchy trains for obedience, not for discernment. And so if someone is, positioned as the authority, I'm thinking back again to the Jodi Hildebrandt thing where she was really positioned as the authority who was, positioned as the person to save these folks' relationships, right? And when you're in that place of authority, very often you as the mentee or coachee can stop checking in with yourself, with your body, with your timing, with your truth, right? And a lot of these guru type so-called leaders will actually reframe some of these things, right? Like I said, you're asking questions is that you're not obedient enough and you're not following the rules. So sometimes they will reframe confusions or asking questions as ego, right? And maybe sometimes they'll reframe your discomfort as, oh, you're just being fearful. Or maybe you're unhealed, right? And you have work to do. And this furthers the hierarchy, right? This furthers your need to keep them around. And it's manipulative because a healthy support doesn't require submission. It requires presence. It's not about them telling you what to do. And if you're listening and you have hired various support coaches, mentors, etc., to help tell you what to do, then I have been there. I have absolutely done that. I have outsourced my own, things I didn't know how to proceed with. And there's nothing wrong with getting guidance. So don't get me wrong on this. However, if you're looking for all of your answers to come from someone else, you're missing the place that your answers truly already exist. You don't need to look outside of yourself to find the answers. What often can be helpful is support to help you reconnect with yourself, to get you back in touch with the answers you have within. It's not your fault that you're disconnected. We aren't taught, most of us are not taught how to connect with ourselves, how to stay in touch with our own truth. And that can make us vulnerable to these sort of manipulative gurus. Another thing I kind of want to talk about is how the algorithm appears to be feeding a lot of people a real gender war, because the feed is showing the most extreme versions of the opposite gender. And I think men are looking and seeing like women are the problem and they only want this certain thing and not all men are that. And women are thinking like men are the problem. It's toxic masculinity and these men are, not willing to step up. And what happens then is that everyone walks into potential relationships or dating basically with their, with their dukes up instead of with their hearts open. And I know everyone wants to protect their heart, right? So oftentimes if we've had our heart broken, and I spoke about this in an episode in season 3 about heartbreak, we often shut down And yet we still crave that deep connection. And there's a paradox there, because we have to be willing to risk it for the biscuit. If we want that deep, meaningful connection, we want to find true, meaningful love, we have to be willing to put our heart on the line. So here's the thing that I really want to say about this sort of divisive gender thing, is that this is an illusion. Because what I've observed is that we're not nearly as far apart as the internet makes us believe. We're just listening to the wrong teachers. We were raised on narratives like men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Cute. But it's a terrible relationship foundation. Because humans are not different species. We don't need fucking translation manuals because we're not from different fucking planets. Okay, so there's some arguments for some like biological differences and such. But some of it, most of it, really comes down to conditioning and the habits that we formed and adaptations and evolution. And what we need to come together to recognize our sameness instead of continuing to poke at our differences are relational skills, emotional literacy, and a safety to express ourselves, and perhaps most importantly, our own self-awareness. And when you're taught things are fundamentally different between genders, you essentially stop looking for the places where you're fundamentally the same. And I think sometimes we overgeneralize that, men are always this or women are always this. And a lot of it is actually cultural. It's not that we're truly that different. It's just that the conditioning, the patriarchal conditioning, the gender conditioning, the different cultures, and of course, this isn't even the same all across the world. There are different cultures that do see genders differently than we do. They see them, as more of a spectrum and not as a great divide. But this conditioning that we see, that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and that men are so different than women, often keeps couples apart far more than any actual difference ever could. Patriarchy taught us that men are meant to be the stoic providers to win at all costs, while women are meant to be the emotional managers, the nurturers, right? And no wonder it's a fucking mess, because men were discouraged from feeling and women were encouraged to feel for everyone. So women end up mothering and men end up armored up. At the end of the day, both end up frustrated as hell. But these are patterns. These are conditioning. These are not identities. They're not morality. And they're certainly not our destiny. Because conditioning, just like it was learned, can also be unlearned. And here's, I think, what is often missed by the gurus, because most online advice lives in the extremes, right? That is what gets the clicks. That is what creates the ad revenue. That is what gets people to stay on platform. That is what the algorithms push. So most online advice is living in these extremes. They either blame other people or they baby them. And neither of these builds real connection. Healthy relationships require both parties to develop emotional skill. So you can be compassionate about someone's conditioning and hold them accountable for unhelpful patterns. Both of those things at once. This is not about tolerating poor behavior. This is about just having a tiny bit of understanding and then setting really healthy boundaries for yourself. You can understand the why someone might have done something without excusing the behavior. And here's a piece that matters maybe most of all. Accountability without compassion is punishment. Take that in. And compassion without accountability is simply avoidance. Who's guilty of that, right? And I don't mean guilty and go feel bad. I just mean, I think we've all done this, right? But accountability without hierarchy, that's where I see real growth happening. Because it sounds something like, I trust you to know when this no longer fits. And actually, this is something that my partner and I very early on in our relationship agreed wholeheartedly on that as long as we were having fun together in our relationship, that we would keep going. And if at any point in time we weren't having a good time together, or wasn't feeling like it was right for us, that we would have a conversation, and that neither of us would try to hold the other person there, right? That we wouldn't try and force something just to avoid being alone. So I trust you to know when this no longer fits. And the same is true of a coaching relationship, because we're not meant to be perpetually healing. We are meant to be growing and expanding. And sometimes that means we've completed a piece of our journey and it's time to move on to something different. It also can look like I'll reflect patterns to you. I will be your mirror, but I won't decide for you, right? This is the opportunity to walk beside, to see what you see and share that with a person, but not telling them what to do or how to do it, letting them truly sit with themselves and decide what feels really right for them with some ideas and some guidance, ultimately landing in their decision. And at the end of the day, healthy relationships don't mean that you owe the other person agreement, right? It does not mean that you are not going to have questions or to have different opinions and that you are always going to agree. And this is important in, romantic relationships, in friendships, in work relationships, and it also applies in the coach or mentor type relationships. If we are always agreeing with someone, we're probably doing so to keep the peace or to avoid conflict. And sometimes it's because we don't have the capacity for conflict. Sometimes it's because we maybe don't know what we truly feel, and there hasn't been a space, safe space created to figure out how we actually feel ourselves. And sometimes it's just the hierarchy playing out and telling us that that's how it is and that's how it's going to be. You also don't owe anybody loyalty. That is earned. That is a gift. That is, the sort of thing that builds in time. And the thing that I think about often is how so many of these gurus will blacklist people who disagreed or who completed their programs or who asked questions or who just simply disagreed. And we deserve a different kind of support. We deserve support that doesn't trap people, that doesn't order people around, that doesn't require people to follow my way or the highway. But instead, it strengthens them. It guides them back to their own intuition, their own ideas. Even if they don't know what they are yet, it creates a safe space for them to do that exploration. And this, guidance for the whole human is what strengthens people, not telling them what to do. And I want to talk a little bit here as well about how to find someone who can support you in your journey, because lived experience really matters. And I talk about this quite a bit because knowledge is cute, but embodiment is where the real wisdom or power lies. The reality is that anybody can talk about patterns. They can search this shit up on ChatGPT and tell you, what the 4 attachment styles are and things that you can say and do in the circumstances of a conflict or whatever. But your real embodied wisdom that comes from having lived experience is entirely different. And few people have lived the undoing and rebuilding of themselves. Real relational wisdom doesn't come from textbooks. And it's not just guaranteed because of longevity. It's born from repairing things in real time, having the same sort of conflict or the same sort of patterns arising and then choosing to respond differently. It comes from heartbreak that forces you to find clarity about what it is that you want. It comes from divorce calling off a wedding, leaving a relationship, leaving dysfunctional dynamics. It comes from self-exploration, learning emotional literacy, sometimes the hard way. And it comes from building a relationship that actually truly works. And I think that's a lot about the guidance that we get. And what the advice that I don't even want to say advice, but the suggestion I would give to you is that if you're looking for support, to find someone who is actually living the outcomes that you desire for yourself. Because people can only take you as deep as they've gone themselves. And actually, this applies within the relationships of all kinds, right? In a relationship with a romantic partner as well. People can only take you as deep as they've gone themselves. And a lot of gurus haven't gone anywhere. They've just learned to market. And this is why I don't want to be anyone's guru. I'm not here to be anyone's savior. And I don't want to create anything that depends on people doubting themselves in order to be successful. What I want to offer lives deeper than what the algorithms reward, because it isn't built on hierarchy. So here's the invitation. Stop giving your relational power away to gurus who thrive on chaos. Stop absorbing advice from people who profit off of you being afraid of one another. Stop treating gender as a binary, as a destiny, as a pure identity. Stop confusing perfected scripts for real intimacy. Stop believing that transformation requires surrendering your authority. Humans are not from different planets. We're just running different conditioning. And the moment that you drop the narratives, connection gets a whole lot easier. Thanks for listening. If this rant landed, hit follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And check out my additional resources at coachchristyholt.com. If you're craving clarity in your own relationship, reach out. I'd love to connect. I love you. Now let's go do some epic shit, shall we?